Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Well, today I want to give a big picture update on where Bitcoin stands in its largest cycle. I want to talk about all our data and what that is telling us. Paint a bit of a picture of what comes next for altcoins. We're going to touch on, gold and silver, and particularly the geopolitical backdrop of how this all ties together and where things are heading, and how to protect your wealth. So it's crazy to think it's nearly been 3 years since I did this video when Bitcoin was 17k, saying, hey, I think the bottom's in, and I gave this rough guide of where I think things will play out this cycle, and spoke about how once we get beyond that 100k range, we can't really crystal ball it from 3 years out. We have to talk about, what's happening at the time to give our next predictions and forecasts of where we are. So one thing I want to talk about is if this market has now matured to the point where these 4-year cycles and halvings are less relevant. As I've spoken about in a lot of videos, now that we're at this multi-trillion-dollar market cap, I think Bitcoin starts to behave more like the stock market does, with the drawdowns being less and the market more dictated by what is going on in terms of M2 money supply, money printing, legislation around crypto, which is now all pretty friendly, all these types of things as this asset class has matured. But let's just have a look at the market cap. So as I said, we're over 2 trillion now for Bitcoin, $500 billion for ETH. We've got a few here around the 100 billion, and then we kind of filter all the way down to where there's a lot, hovering around that 10 billion mark, and keep those figures in mind as we go through further. But if you go into our data section on our website, I might just move myself out of the way so you can see that a bit better. But these are the previous cycle tops. And this is the indicator of all these things I've looked at over the years that Philip's packaged into this great cheat sheet, basically. And, a lot of red signals flashing at the top. And we haven't really got that yet. We've got a few starting to come through, but really these big drivers and tailwinds of Bitcoin are still in play. So I want to talk about, what my gut is telling me and tie this all together as well. But this is really important that we are data driven as well, and try to take the emotion out of it, as well as, you can always acknowledge those gut feelings. And I want to talk about taking profits and that as well. But it's all still looking pretty good in terms of our data and metrics. And our risk on, risk off model, again, still mostly green. It's still suggesting that this is a good time to have exposure to Bitcoin with all the global liquidity and all these things that we look at. And that is a very different scenario to talking about altcoins. And again, I want to emphasize that fact that I think we have to treat Bitcoin as a different asset to altcoins, and when to get out of altcoins, which I'm going to get to. But let's just have a talk about the geopolitical backdrop and everything that's happening that is, I believe, going to influence crypto, but just the economy as well, jobs and all these things that are happening. So I've spoken about how I think the US is going to use crypto and stable coins as a way to kind of offset and inflate away that debt. And we had some Russian advisors come out and talk about this now, how they really think that this 35 trillion in debt, they're going to try and move it into the crypto cloud, as he says here, and devalue it and start from scratch. And we know that there's this huge push for CBDCs, and the US dominates the stablecoin space. They're all fully regulated. So this can absolutely be something that happens. And they say that legally all these stablecoins have to be backed by US dollars or US debt to create more demand for treasuries, all this type of thing. And how is this going to make these other global superpowers feel? Are they going to be annoyed with the US for doing this at the expense of the rest of the world and other currencies? Are they forced to also go in on crypto if they know that Trump is going to try and inflate this huge crypto bubble to pay off and offset that debt? Does that force China and Russia and other superpowers to all have Bitcoin treasury? So I absolutely think that this is a likely scenario to play out, and that would mean Bitcoin goes a lot higher from here. But we have to talk about what's happening for the average person, the grassroots, and are retail going to be investing in altcoins at a time when there's this cost of living crisis and civil unrest? And these are just unprecedented times. What we've seen in Nepal with citizens hunting down politicians and burning down the parliament. We've seen it across Europe where it's just getting worse. We've got these big marches due this Saturday in the UK. So Who knows what happens there? I think there's more marches scheduled in Australia. Things like, rest in peace, Charlie Kirk. These are just wild, wild times that we're living through, where it feels like a lot of the Western world is a powder keg that's just waiting to blow, with the media driving this division while immigration is being pushed. And it feels like there's some sort of civil unrest, if not civil war, coming to these places, and other countries, they're overthrowing their government. So it's just a very, very uncertain time for the average person. And that's why I don't think that we're going to get this retail-driven altcoin cycle like we have in previous times. And I want to talk about how I actually think, as I've said so much over the recent years, and how we've constructed our portfolios, in our model portfolio section, and my portfolio in particular, what we've spoken about is being heavy in the top end of town, those top sort of 10 assets, as always, really heavy Bitcoin and ETH, but heavy these other assets that are in the top 10 or 20 that are likely to get ETFs. Now, we had another round of ETFs past that next stage of SEC approval today, XRP, Litecoin, Stellar. So these are all the things that I've spoken about that are coming, and now it's all happening. So if all these crypto ETFs get approved, we're going to have these mixed basket ETFs for the top 10 and all this sort of thing. So this is where the money is going to flow into altcoins this cycle, love it or hate it. Now, as a crypto OG, I kind of feel that a lot of this is pretty sad, that we've completely lost our initial ethos and what drove us to build out decentralized infrastructure, a decentralized internet, privacy, freedom, libertarians, all these things that initially, attracted people into crypto. So yeah, I'd love to see that get a bit of a revival as we head down this totalitarian path of, companies, corporations, and BlackRock's all just buying up crypto ETFs, all this type of thing. That's not what we want. And that's why I'm still really bullish on Bitcoin DeFi, privacy, decentralization. I think that's what we need to focus on for the next cycle. And that's kind of the coins that I'll be happy to hold on to into the future, because I think that hasn't played out yet. I might have been one cycle early on Bitcoin DeFi and Bitcoin Layer 2s. So that's why when I'm choosing to sell all my altcoins, as I think we might be getting close to the top, which I'll talk about now, you've got to think about, what are you prepared to hold? What do you still believe in? Versus way too many retail investors still holding all these alts that are going to get ETFs. I think it's almost impossible to see them doing multiples and making new all-time highs, because we're just not going to get that retail money into these lower cap coins. Okay, so when I first drew these cycles, I spoke about how I think, we get that grinding up period, that first correction for a few months, which we got, another correction, which we've got, and then kind of we head into the blow off top. So this BLX hasn't updated. It's at 108,000 Bitcoins trading at 116 at the moment, and looking like it wants to have another push higher. But I spoke about how once we kind of get above, expect some resistance around 100, and we got that pullback. But once we get through 100, we're kind of looking around 130, 150, something like that. And then we re-look at all our factors, and those tailwinds are still in play. It's still telling us to be bullish and allocated as far as Bitcoin is concerned. So previous time cycles have, peaked around November. So does that mean that the next few months we are going to have this kind of parabolic spike and push towards 150 or even higher in towards the 200s? But I do think that these cycles are less relevant now. So, I don't think that we maybe get a 2-year bear market that pulls back 70%, 80%, things like that we've seen in the past. Fully expect that now this asset class has matured, it can just grind higher and trade more like the stock market. And that's why being data driven is so important on knowing when to sell. Okay, so let's have a look at some other things now, Bitcoin dominance and altcoins. So Bitcoin dominance looks like it does want to roll over and have another push down, which ties into all these ETFs coming online in the next few weeks and months for this last part of the cycle. But I think it's really time to start planning on taking some profits and rotating back into Bitcoin or whatever your life goals are. If you've hit your goals and you followed us when we called the bottom for ETH at 800 and Bitcoin and whatever, you should be sitting on some huge profits. at the moment. If those life goals were to pay off your mortgage or your debt, get out of the cities if you're worried about the way the world's heading, whatever that freedom and sovereignty represents, hopefully you're hitting some of those goals. So if Bitcoin dominance is rolling over, let's have a look at some of the alt charts. ETH had a breakout here, the pullback to retest these levels, and it looks like it wants to push up again. But on the really high time frames, depending on how you draw this, whether you look at the weekly, where we can argue that ETH's broken out, come back and retested, that's looking really nice. This is the level we want to get above here on that ETH BTC chart. And yeah, with these ETH staking ETFs and stuff coming online, I think we can make the case that ETH can go a lot higher. But again, depending on how you draw this, we can also kind of make the case on a monthly chart that ETH has hit this, that's been a bit of resistance and rolling over again. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of level we want to see cleared if ETH's going to really outperform and power towards $10,000 ETH. So that's what I'm watching there. The other thing I want to look at here is total 3. So this is the total market cap of all altcoins, all the crypto market, minus Bitcoin and ETH. And I've also subtracted the stable coins, USDC, USDT market cap, to have a look at just what those altcoins are doing outside of Bitcoin and ETH. And this looks like it does want to break out and have another push to fresh all-time highs. So that's a really positive thing, ties together with Bitcoin dominance, everything else that we are looking at. But when we do look at these cycles, we can see that this peaked last time in November. And so we're getting close to that mark. We're kind of a couple of months away from these cycles, which I do think are going to hold more true, particularly for those lower cap altcoins. Maybe the ones with the ETFs start to break that cycle and trade like the top tech stocks in the NASDAQ and start to trend higher as Bitcoin trades like its own asset class as well now. But I don't think if we get into this parabolic phase, you do not want to be overexposed and continuing to hold altcoins. Having a plan over the next few weeks and months to take some profits is kind of the message I'm getting at here. So, we've got to remember, we've had a tremendous run on some of these alts like Solana that bottomed at $8, and there was plenty of time to accumulate around $20. Jason, who's on our team, was so bullish on Sol, and the new Sol phones that are coming out. There's plenty of good stuff happening in the Sol ecosystem. So, maybe it goes on an absolute tear and really surprises a lot of people towards, who knows, $500 or beyond. But I still don't think that means you can't take some profits here along the way. And if it goes higher, sell a little bit more and start to be cashing in, because you have to acknowledge that we are getting to the later stage of this cycle and where we've come from 3 years ago. So for all those big orders, obviously we recommend Uptrend, link down below. I'll just mention Nugget News and the guys will look after you for those big orders. But one thing I want to talk about now is gold and silver. So a few months ago in our VIP call, monthly call that we do with our high net worth guys, I spoke about starting to maybe get some exposure to silver in particular, if you haven't already, because obviously over the years I've always been bullish on gold and silver, but 24 trillion market cap for gold now. This is a pretty huge market cap, and so there's still plenty of room for growth of Bitcoin. It's only 10% of this. Long term, Bitcoin can continue to go higher, but silver in particular only a 1 trillion market cap, and it's had a pretty good run of late. So, you never want to be chasing parabolic markets like this. But if we stop and think about, well, where do you want to protect your wealth with the way the world's going? I think a mix of Bitcoin, gold, silver, having some dollars or stable coins on the sidelines, these are all the best options that particularly if you're a really high net worth person, where else are you going to park your wealth in this backdrop of all the political stuff that's going on and freezing bank accounts and making it so difficult to move your own money? So having control of your own wealth, having that freedom, paying off your debts, setting up your life somewhere where you want to live that you think is the best place, all these types of things are such important discussions to be having now. So since I did that video for our high net worths, silver's taken off. One of the few commodities or assets that hasn't broken new all-time highs from, a decade plus ago. So I still think that this is a really good play. But this is just a fascinating time to be alive, guys. So Bitcoin, despite being, become commercialized and BlackRock having a lot of influence and stuff, love it or hate it, it is still one of the best places to protect your wealth, have your own keys, you're protecting your own coins. All these things have never been more important than ever. But in terms of that cycle, just a few things to watch, particularly with altcoins. That is probably my message for today. You do not want to be overexposed, and it's never a bad time when you're sitting on these big gains to be taking some profit. So I hope you guys have enjoyed that big picture update. Smash that like button, share these videos around, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you again soon. Cheers.